No time to waste. It's me, Eli, and we're gonna pick up right where we left off. Which would be with this. The elevator door sliding open, revealing a long concrete hallway and a figure standing there waiting for us, a figure that both Tristan and I recognized at the same instant. And simultaneously, in disbelief, we said, "Nolan?" Because that's right. The person standing only 10 feet or so in front of the elevator, looking calmly back at us, was none other than Tristan's brother and my best friend. Nolan grinned and held his arms out, as if expecting us to come in for a big group hug. And yes, I did use this moment to verify that he had fingers and therefore was not an MJ. "Tristan! Eli! Girl who I've never met but I'm sure is great!" Cautiously, I stepped forward out of the elevator, pulling Zoe with me, though I made no move to close the entire distance between us to hug Nolan. Don't get me wrong, I considered it. I wanted to. It was Nolan, after all. But something held me back. Probably that I'd searched for him for months, and now he suddenly turned up down here, underground, supposedly in the same place the monsters originated and where there was a way out. That was weird. I knew my best friend, and he wouldn't have escaped on his own without trying to find me or save his brother first. Also, no offense to Nolan, but Tristan was the one doing most of the monster killing, so Nolan would have had a hard time getting this far alone. Possibly also that he was wearing a lab coat. And I don't know if you've ever seen any movies with evil organizations in them, but the bad guys are always in lab coats. My heart was already heavy as I hesitantly asked, "Nolan, what are you doing here?" Nolan slowly dropped his arms, his smile slipping a bit. I gotta be honest, Eli, I was hoping for a little more enthusiasm after all this time. I didn't get a chance to reply, because Tristan had shoved past me and Zoe, walking up to stand face to face with his brother. Though Tristan was considerably worse for wear, it was still striking how alike they looked. They were the same height, had the same dark hair, nearly identical faces. Their expressions, though, that was where the difference was clear. "Nolan," said Tristan quietly, in a voice that was way more dangerous and terrifying than any yell could have been. "There's no logical way you should be here. We both know that. So I can't believe I'm saying this. But answer Eli's question." There was a long moment of silence before Nolan finally sighed and dropped his gaze from his brother's. I didn't envy the staring contest they just had. I knew that feeling. He raised his hands in mock surrender. "Alright, fine. You got me. I work here. But it's not as bad as it looks." I'm pretty sure my heart had sunk to my feet at this point. Tristan was apparently feeling similarly, though he took a different approach to his feelings. He shoved Nolan back against the wall and yelled, "What the fuck, Nolan? I worked with you for months. I comforted you when Mom and Dad died. I did everything I could to make sure you survived. And I thought you'd do the same for me. What the fuck?" Tristan was pressing Nolan against the wall so hard, his arm against Nolan's neck, that Nolan could only make choking sounds, unable to get any words out. "I know you're pissed, and I get it, but ease up," shouted Zoe, still holding my hand with her good one. "He can't talk, you moron!" Tristan glanced back over his shoulder at us and gave us a death glare, TM, but seemed to recognize that Zoe was right. Still scowling, he lessened the amount of force he was applying on Nolan's neck, if only slightly. It was enough, though. Nolan gasped for air and took several shaky breaths. "Wow, Tristan," he said, smiling and chuckling as if this was a fun little joke we were all in on. "I would have thought your time inside that bear— what does Eli call them? Oh yeah, mics, after that racist asshole on our basketball team. Well, I would have thought your time inside the mic would have relaxed some of your aggressive tendencies." Tristan was giving the most intense death glare, TM, I'd ever seen to Nolan right now, and that's saying something, considering the amount of intense death glares, TM, Tristan has given me. "I thought you'd been swallowed too," he growled. No, after I guessed wrong about the blind spots, I couldn't figure out how to kill it in time, so I fled, and I planned to track it down later with better weapons, but I could never find it. I've done nothing wrong here. I was gonna use these resources these people have to get you out. I couldn't take it anymore. I'd been best friends with Nolan since kindergarten, and here he was, acting first like nothing was wrong, and now straight up lying. He'd always been a good liar, but I knew all his tricks. And I could tell by the way his eye twitched, only a tiny bit, barely noticeable, unless you knew what to look for, that he was lying now. I dropped Zoe's hand and stepped up beside Tristan, pulling my pistol from my belt as I did so, holding it down at my hip and keeping it aimed towards Nolan. I could tell he saw. His eyes widened and he made a sound of disbelief. "Whoa, Eli, what are you doing, man? I told you I've done nothing wrong. I've been spying on the inside. Let me explain." I almost believed him. I wanted to, but his eye twitched again. "He's lying," I said to Tristan, staring at my former best friend as my mind raced 1,000 miles a minute. I was trying to piece it together, and what was beginning to fall into place wasn't looking pretty. "Holy shit," I said out loud as the answer to the mic lie occurred to me. It made sense. Both Tristan and Nolan looked at me, Nolan's eyes wide and Tristan squinting at me in uncertainty. Finally Tristan said, "Well, what?" And I realized I hadn't actually said anything after the "holy shit" exclamation. Too busy connecting dots in my head. Oops. "He planned it," I said. "The whole story you told about finding the elevator. You said you saw it once, and the very next day you got eaten by the mic. You got eaten by a monster you'd never encountered before, and Nolan guessed wrong for the first time ever. But he didn't guess wrong." I was staring at Nolan in disgust at this point, because as I was talking, I could tell by the look on his face that I was getting it right, or at least pretty close. And that realization made me feel like the guy in front of me wasn't the same person I trusted and cared about for the past 15 years. He knew what the mic was. Hell, maybe he even helped make it. But he intentionally told you the wrong thing so that you'd get eaten. And why? Because you found the elevator, and you weren't supposed to, finished Zoe, coming up beside us. Her voice held an impressive mix of awe and repulsion. I like to think the awe was due to my stellar work in piecing together the truth. Stay out of this, Zoe, hissed Nolan. Not your fight. We all froze for a minute. Then Zoe stepped closer, hefting her axe up under a good shoulder. If you were as innocent as you say, you shouldn't know my name, she said. You did plan for that mic to eat Tristan, didn't you? Nolan was silent at first, but then Tristan pressed his arm into Nolan's neck harder, and Nolan's eyes flicked to my gun and Zoe's axe, and I think he realized this was not a confrontation he could easily avoid. He sighed. Just let me off the wall so I can breathe better and I'll tell you everything. Promise. Your promises are just empty words now, growled Tristan. But this time, Nolan wasn't lying. I put my hand on Tristan's shoulder. He's telling the truth, I said quietly. Put him down. Let him talk. I'm not pointing the pistol away anytime soon. Tristan shot me maybe his most brutal death glare, TM, yet. I literally stepped back to put distance between me and the hatred in his face. I don't take orders from you, he said. But I guess he was curious too, because a second later he slowly lowered his arm and backed up, letting Nolan go. I did that because I wanted to hear him talk too. Not because you told me to, he informed me. I rolled my eyes. Wasn't that the kind of thing you said to your siblings when you were like in 3rd grade? But whatever. I was actually feeling more forgiving towards Tristan than towards Nolan at that moment, which is a terrifying reality. Never thought I'd see the day I trusted Tristan more. Yet here we were, and I hated what I might hear my best friend say. I didn't see a way that he could be working here and not be involved in the awful hell we had gone through. I wanted him to be a spy on the inside or whatever it was he'd said, but I had a horrible, hollow feeling in my gut that said otherwise. Still, though, I wanted to hear him talk. Maybe he could explain, and I wouldn't have to deal with the crushing betrayal by my best friend that I was currently facing. Maybe he'd at least have some answers about everything that had happened in the past year. Thank you, said Nolan, rubbing his neck. It was red and a bit swollen. I was sure Tristan had pressed hard enough that it would bruise. Okay, now let's all just stay calm and let me talk. Fine, I said, but tell the real truth, even if it's bad. I'll know if you're lying, and I've killed enough monsters by now that I think I could kill another without much trouble. We stared each other down for a long moment, and the pit in my stomach only grew larger. Whatever was behind Nolan's eyes now was something entirely new, something haunting that had never been there before. Finally, he held up his hands in surrender and smiled, a fake smile that wasn't quite convincing, and faded immediately. All right, he said. I did plan for the mic. You have to understand, Tristan was never supposed to see the elevator. I tried my hardest to convince him to go a different route that day. If he'd never seen it, I wouldn't have had to get rid of him. But he did. That night I was told I had to make sure he didn't investigate further. I couldn't kill him, though. He was all I had left. So I figured I could just tell him something slightly wrong about the mic and get rid of him like that. Floating in a timeless black hole forever beats a brutal death, right? Mostly peaceful. And I hoped that maybe I could get him back someday when this was all over. My brain was working overtime like a madman, developing 6 new questions for every one Nolan answered. It was also actively trying to ignore my heart, which was sending signals that it was broken by Nolan's betrayal. Tristan was looking downright murderous. I was honestly afraid he might jump on Nolan and just strangle him, but against all odds, he managed to restrain himself. It wasn't mostly peaceful, he said. It was terrifying. And you know, my last thoughts were about you. I'm so glad my dying moments were spent worrying about a brother who purposefully fed me to a monster. Nolan did have the common decency to look a bit shameful at that, at least. What do you mean, when this was all over? I asked carefully. Start at the beginning. Zoe adjusted her axe. I won't say it was intentional, but it sure drew Nolan's eyes, causing him to swallow hard before continuing, so maybe it was. My pistol was still aimed directly at his stomach, too, and Tristan was beside me looking like a threatened watchdog ready to defend its property, so the intimidation factor wasn't too shabby. Fine, said Nolan. You know, I said I got a position working with a lab at the university? Well, I mean, that was mostly true. There was a lab there, and they said they were looking for students specifically from our city to work with them, which seemed to make sense, you know, since we're only a few hours away from campus, and lots of students from our high school went there. And I thought, hey, it's a genetics lab, and they want students from the area where I'm from, it's meant to be. So I put in my resume, and before I knew it, I'd been interviewed and then accepted, and I was working at the lab. I was nodding along during this, because I knew about the lab. Well, only vague details, he'd never been specific. But he'd mentioned it. The exciting experiments they were doing, and how after a month or two they let him get significantly more involved, how already as a freshman he was working on research with real scientists, how this could be a great leg up for grad school and a future career. I'd been so happy for him at the time, but now I was beginning to see where this was going, and I was not excited. Well, they kept me hands off for a while, doing small tasks, asking me questions, testing the waters. And by October, I guess they decided they liked me, because they sat me down and told me about the real project they were doing. The big one, they called it. They were an offshoot of a whole organization. I won't say the name because you wouldn't know it anyway. I swear Zoe rolled her eyes so hard at this that they nearly rolled out of her head. Not because it's above you or something, Nolan added quickly, probably upon seeing our expressions. Like, you actually wouldn't know it, because they're kept under wraps by the government. The government sanctioned, but what they do, well, it's kept secret, like Area 51, because the government wants to do certain experiments without the public knowing. It's not exactly legal stuff. I threw my gun-free hand up, gesturing vaguely around us. Oh, you mean all this isn't legal? I exclaimed. I'm shocked. Nolan shot me an exasperated Eli shut the fuck up look. It was all too familiar, and for just a second I recognized my best friend. But then that second was over. Anyway, he said pointedly, they told me what they were doing, and what their plan was, and said I could be heavily involved. It was such a great opportunity. But they had certain conditions, too. They gave me 24 hours to decide, and said it would be a mistake if I refused. He closed his eyes briefly. I don't think I had a choice. They just told me government secrets. If I'd said no, I'd probably turn up naked in a ditch somewhere. Uh-huh, said Zoe. Sucks. No sympathy here. Keep going. Wow, tough crowd, said Nolan, trying again to chuckle and smile at us. No one smiled back. I'm pretty sure I could hear crickets, even though it was a concrete tunnel and there were definitely no crickets. That's how awkward that silence was. Finally, Nolan cleared his throat and resumed. I signed some paperwork, and they said that from then on I couldn't tell anyone any details about the work we were doing. But God, it was so cool. His eyes were sparkling now in a way that I really didn't like. All the monsters that Eli so creatively named after people we went to school with. Nice work, by the way, he said, glancing at me, winking. They'd been designing them, perfecting them for years, and they were finishing. The genetics of it all was just incredible. The government had commissioned the whole thing. It had some official code name, but everyone at the lab just called it the Frankenstein Project. You know, because they were making monsters. Zoe groaned. That's not original, at all. But at least they knew that Frankenstein was the scientist, not the actual monster, she said. See, told you she hates that misconception. Nolan continued as if he hadn't heard her. Apparently the monsters are meant to be used as weapons. A new kind of warfare or something. Maybe against other countries. I don't know the details. They wouldn't tell me that stuff. But with any new creation, you have to run trials first. By this point, me, Zoe, and Tristan were all dead silent, staring at Nolan with mixed expressions of fascination and horror. Because I think we'd all figured out where this was going. Nolan had the decency to look down at the ground at least. That's why they wanted students from the city specifically, he said. Because they decided to do the first trial run here. I helped a lot with that part. The city limits, the layouts, the logistics. It was just so interesting. They'd managed to build entirely new creatures with unique genes that no one else in the world had ever studied. Do you know how incredible an opportunity it is for a college freshman studying genetics? He shook his head and finally raised his eyes again. I was disappointed to see they were empty of tears. I feel like he should have been crying as he recalled how he'd, helped murder an entire city out of scientific curiosity. I helped them with all of it. They'd been working on this compound beneath the city for some time, too. To watch everything, to keep working down here and send more monsters up as needed. And I thought I'd be down here with them. But the week before day 0, they told me they wanted someone on the inside. And since I knew the city, it should be me. We were still silent. Sure, normally I'd say it sucked that whatever organization this was had basically lured my best friend in, got him trapped, and then tricked him into thinking he'd be working on the experiment when actually he'd be a part of it. But in this case, no. Yeah, I felt a little bad, but not that bad. Nolan had stuck around when he realized what was going to happen after all. He hadn't warned anyone back home he cared about. He hadn't tried to stop it. No, instead he'd enthusiastically gone along with it because he wanted to see what happened too. And he didn't even seem to feel guilty. With every word he spoke, I was more and more certain that the guy in front of me had changed. He was no longer my lifelong best friend. I'm no saint, but I'd never pull any shit on this level, and I sure as hell wouldn't have been friends with anyone who did. I protested at first, but then I figured I could at least save my family and we could survive it together, he said, glancing at Tristan, who continued to stare murderously back at him. I told them that. They said no, that a whole family surviving would be suspicious, and if anything went wrong, it would make it easy to trace the experiment back to me, and therefore to the lab. But they were willing to compromise. Here he closed his eyes again, and when he opened them, this time, I saw they were wet for the first time in our meeting. They said I could choose one family member, that they'd help me make sure whoever I chose survived the initial attack, but then it was up to me. And I should continue to live in the dome and play along until they said otherwise. Now Tristan broke the silence. He stepped forward, slowly, dangerously, and the look on his face was blood-chilling. Are you saying that you chose to kill Mom and Dad? His words were quiet, his voice deadly. Nolan instinctively tried to back up, but the wall was still right behind him, and he was cornered. No, he insisted. I'm saying I chose to save you. I couldn't save you all. They wouldn't let me. But I chose you, because I thought you'd be good at all this, and I thought we could grow closer, as close as we were when we were little, and I thought you wouldn't question my interest or knowledge of the monsters. Tristan was almost nose to nose with Nolan now. Anything else? He growled. Nolan was looking very flustered, and tears were now spilling out of his eyes in earnest, though whether out of actual guilt or just fear for his life, it was impossible to say. I thought you'd be too busy taking your anger out on monsters to take much notice in anything weird I did, or to stumble across the elevator. Oh, I see, said Tristan quietly. You thought it'd be easiest to trick me. You thought I was the stupidest. And that was enough for you to give the go-ahead to kill our parents. Nolan tried to protest, but Tristan steamrolled right over him, his voice low and, quite honestly, terrifying. I suppose all the crying after the deaths was fake. Well, I had no idea you were such a fantastic actor. I would be proud if it was my brother who was so talented, but you're no brother of mine. Tristan's voice and eyes were so cold that I swear the hallway had dropped 10 degrees. I stood there, pistol in hand, genuinely convinced that Tristan was about to attempt to murder Nolan right in front of us. And what did I do then? Shoot him? Shoot Nolan and help finish the job? Whose side was I on here? I didn't know. But Tristan didn't. He simply took a step back and then stood there, arms crossed, never looking away from his brother's face. I saved you twice, actually, Nolan insisted, finally finding his words. When Eli got you out of that mic, I made sure you survived the massacre. I knew we were close to the end. I thought I could find you after. We could leave together. He sighed. I didn't think you'd make it here and find out things the hard way. I mean, you hate Eli. I thought it was safe, that you wouldn't tell him anything. But now you're here, and things will have to end differently. Well, that didn't sound good. Tristan said nothing, just continued to stare menacingly. Zoe interjected instead. Nolan, she said cautiously, where's everyone else? Why would they leave you here alone? And if you're legally sworn to secrecy, why did you just tell us everything? Suddenly Nolan's tears were gone, and now he smiled, perhaps the first real smile he'd had since we'd come down here. So much for feeling guilty. What an interesting question. I'm glad you asked. They're all gone. They've moved on to the next city, getting ready to start the next trial there. I'm here because you all are the last survivors. Did you know that? Congratulations. It's just 3 of you left. I really am happy that it's you guys. He looked at me. I didn't help you, you know. This was all you. But I'm thrilled that if anyone made it this long, it's you, Eli. And honestly not surprised. You always were tougher than you gave yourself credit for. I did enjoy watching you. I was impressed. You know, normally I'd love the compliments, but I'm having a hard time appreciating them from my former best friend who's turned out to be a raging sociopath, I said. He chuckled and shook his head. No sociopath here. I won't apologize for prioritizing science in my career, not to mention my country, since this is for the government. I'd argue it's all for the greater good. Holy fuck, I said. They've brainwashed you. You're just as bad as them. Zoe said, you know, the greater good is very, very great or good. In Harry Potter or in real life. Eli talked so highly of you. I wish I'd met you when you were still that person. And Tristan said nothing, just continued to stare with a look that was somehow so much more terrifying than the death glare, TM. Nolan shrugged. Well, it doesn't matter now what you think, and it doesn't matter that I told you everything, because I'm here to make sure that the last survivors don't ever make it out of this dome. So the ending definitely wasn't good. Before any of us could react to the news that Nolan had been waiting around specifically to kill us, he quickly reached under his lab coat, grabbed something, and threw it at the ground. Smoke exploded all around us, and I felt air rush past me as, supposedly, he tried to make an escape. Coughing as I inhaled smoke, eyes watering, I tried to stumble out of it, but the smoke seemed to be everywhere. That is, until I felt someone grab my arm and pull me harshly, dragging me out of the cloud of smoke onto the other side. As my eyes and lungs cleared, I realized it had been Tristan. He'd grabbed Zoe too. Come on, he said. Nolan went that way. So we went after him. I couldn't really run with my busted ankle, so I did a little hobble jump skip thing, and kept up well enough, though pain exploded in my ankle with every step. Do not recommend. He hadn't gone far. Tristan led us down another hallway and then through an open door. At first I wondered why he hadn't made a run for it, but upon entering the room, it was easy to see the reason. We were in some kind of command center. There were screens everywhere. Some showed camera feeds, one showed a map of the city, one had images of me, Zoe, and Tristan displayed, with profiles listed beside them. Let me tell you, it's not a cool thing to see a high school yearbook photo of yourself next to hair, brown, eyes, green, height, 6'1", age, 20, likelihood of survival, 72.6%, and other stats. Like a fucked up driver's license, especially because it was compiled without your permission. Creepy as shit. Although it was kind of flattering to see my likelihood of survival was so high. Too bad that was probably calculated before Nolan had announced his intent to kill us. Zoe's was 85%, if you were wondering, but we all know she's better than me by this point, so that's no surprise. Oh, and of course, in the middle of it, furiously typing away, was Nolan. Tristan wasted no time in sprinting forward and tackling him to the ground. Then they were rolling around in a demented wrestling match. I aimed my gun, but there was no way I could guarantee hitting Nolan. They were moving too fast and looked too alike. It was impossible to tell who was who. Instead, Zoe and I rushed over to the screen to see what Nolan had been doing. And, well, it wasn't pretty. It wasn't quite as cheesy as a big red self-destruct button, but it was in that vein. The screen displayed a map of what could only be the tunnels we were in. This was labeled as Control Center, and there were plenty of other rooms and hallways, including the elevator labeled 2 inside, and one that twisted and turned and eventually read 2 outside. Logically, I assumed this must be inside and outside the dome. Great, right? Well, the only problem was there were about 20 blinking red dots in various locations on the map, and in the upper right corner was a countdown, which currently read 327, 326, 325. Zoe and I looked at each other in shock. Nolan had set up this entire place to explode. Suddenly there was a crack behind us, and we spun around to see Nolan scrabbling to his feet and sprinting out of the room, lab coat flying behind him. Tristan was lying on the ground, bleeding profusely from his head. "Fuck," he said. Nolan bashed my head into that screen. Sure enough, the screen above him was fractured like a spider web. But he still jumped to his feet, and leaving a trail of blood, began to exit the room to pursue his brother. "Wait, where the hell are you going?" I protested, gesturing at the screen, which was continuing its angry red countdown. 3 minutes. 2:59. He paused. "I have to finish this," he said. "I owe it to my parents." "You'll die in here," said Zoe. "But I'll make sure he does too," said Tristan grimly. Then he looked at me and gave me the tiniest hint of a smile. "It's been good knowing you, Eli," he said. And then with that fucking revelation, he was gone. "Holy shit," I said. "Did he just admit he doesn't hate me? That's insane." "Yeah, agreed, but let's worry about that later," said Zoe. "Come on!" I tried to run, but even the hop skip earlier had been too much, and I had barely made it to the door of the control center before my ankle gave out in a wave of pain. I tried again to stand, but it crumbled beneath me. I thought it would be the end of the line for me, and looked up to tell Zoe so, but she apparently wasn't having any of it. "Waffles!" she shouted, beckoning him over. He barely fit through the doorway to grab me, but he did, and he simply picked me up bridal style like I weighed nothing. And then we were off, racing to beat the clock. I won't lie, it was not my toughest moment. I felt kind of ridiculous being carried like that as Waffles ran behind Zoe and Mr. Bailey ran beside her. But I guess it wasn't actually the first time he'd done it. At least I was conscious this time, though barely. Between my ankle and the concussion and the bouncing as Waffles carried me, I was suddenly feeling very dizzy. Zoe must have memorized the path to the outside, because she led the way with no hesitation. Thank God for that, because if we'd gone based on my memory and navigation skills, we would have died in there. When we were almost out, we passed Tristan and Nolan, wrestling once again. I wanted to throw my gun to Tristan to use, but there was an equal chance Nolan would have gotten a hold of it, and I didn't want to risk that. Plus, I couldn't have thrown anything accurately anyway, well, with the whole world spinning. Plus, I think Tristan wanted to do it on his own. They were yelling at each other, too, and both were beat up pretty badly from the looks of things. I'm not sure they even noticed us pass by. And then there was an elevator in front of us, just like the one we'd come down in. We hurried in, and thank God this one had buttons. I would have liked to wait for Tristan, but there was no time. It was us or no one. Zoe immediately hit the ground button, and the door slid shut as she looked at her watch and counted 3, 2, 1. We were just starting to move upwards. We were out of reach of the bombs, but we felt the elevator shake, and we heard the explosions. And after a minute, there was nothing but the mechanical humming as we continued our ascent. Finally, a few minutes later, the door slid open, revealing that we were in an ordinary garage. My heart sank at the thought that maybe the second elevator had only led to somewhere else in the dome after all. But Zoe went outside to check and came back grinning ear to ear. "We made it out!" she shouted as Waffles gently put me down. "We're in the suburbs! I can see that motherfucking dome from here! We did it, Eli!" She hugged me, and then I passed out. No, really. The pain in my ankle had gotten to be too much, and I literally smiled at her, and then passed out. Real nice. Anyway, that's where we are. We've been out of the dome for about 72 glorious hours. We're still in the same house. It is just an ordinary empty house, by the way, but one with fresh food and clean sheets and normal internet speeds. God, it feels like such a luxury after the past year. We're laying low for a few days until we get our bearings and recover, and then we'll be figuring out our plan from there. I'll be updating at least one more time, once we know what we're doing. Nolan mentioned other cities. I hope us blowing up the lab delayed things for a while, but I have a feeling this isn't over. And if that's true, Zoe and I feel like we should help where we can. Speaking of Zoe, I may have some updates on that front too, but those can wait. For now, it's enough to say that we're finally free from that fucking hellscape, and I have Zoe, and Waffles, and Mr. Bailey. And really, that's all I need. Oh, and ice cream. I finally have ice cream again, and it's glorious.